said it was the birds, the leaf blowers, the dogs barking down the road. But the truth is, it wasn't the noise outside that bothered him. It was the silence inside. There's a small wooden house tucked beneath the tree line in western North Carolina, where the Blue Ridge rises up like a quiet prayer. And in that house lives a man named Robert. He's not a recluse. Not really. He still waves when the mail truck rattles by. He still answers the phone when his sister calls. But something in him pulled back a few years ago, as if the world got too loud all at once, and the only way to survive it was to make his own smaller, quieter, simpler. Robert's wife June passed away on a Wednesday. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't ask for permission, it just arrives, and before you even get your bearings, it's already taking things from you. After she was gone, the house sounded different. Not empty exactly, just off balance. There was the quiet of grief, and then there was the kind of quiet that follows it, a sort of dull ringing in the chest. The kind that makes even birdsong feel intrusive. The porch used to be their favorite place. Mornings with tea wrapped in old blankets, watching the mist settle across the valley like a gentle hush. June loved the way the cardinals argued with the squirrels, the way life bustled in the branches. She always said the forest had its own kind of rhythm, messy, alive, honest. But to Robert, after it all felt like noise. Too many wings flapping, too many unseen paws scratching under the porch. The wind clattering against the wind chimes sounded more like a warning than music. So one morning he shut the window, not all at once. First, it was just the screen door latch. He stopped letting it bang open like it used to. Then the blinds came down, the bird feeder stayed empty, and eventually the curtains stayed drawn. The light shifted in the house. The air inside thickened. He said it was allergies. Said the birds were getting bold. One even tried to build a nest in the eaves. Said the neighbors were too noisy now with their four-wheelers. Said the world had changed. But the truth sat heavier than that. It wasn't about the noise. It was about how unfamiliar everything sounded without her. You see, grief does strange things to sound. The laugh track on TV shows feels forced. A kettle's whistle feels sharp. Even the comforting creak of a floorboard becomes unbearable when there's no one else walking across it. So he shut the window, and he stopped going out back. There was a time when Robert would wake up before the sun just to watch the light hit the trees behind the shed. He built a birdhouse out there once. Not because he liked birds, but because June did. She named them even when they flew away. "That's Finchley," she'd grin, pointing to a puffball of feathers. He's mouthy. But the birdhouse started to rot, and Robert stopped replacing the seed. In the quiet, the forest kept moving, but Robert did not. He brewed his coffee slower, sat in the same chair, read the same old magazine over and over, even though he'd memorized the crossword answers. Sometimes he played music soft and low, but mostly he listened to nothing. And still the noise came. A branch tapping the window, a fox scream in the distance, coyotes on a cold night. The high, eerie trill of a bobcat scream, one he wouldn't have known how to name at the time. Just one more sound from a world he didn't want to be part of. So he sighed and muttered and stayed inside. Grief isolates, but slowly. It doesn't snatch you away, it persuades you. It makes silence seem safer than song. It makes stillness feel like peace when really it's something else. You don't even notice what you're closing yourself off from, until one day it taps at the window. Literally. It happened on a Sunday morning sometime in early spring. Robert was doing what he always did, staring at the same mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. He didn't plan on going out. The garden had gone wild since last season. The porch chairs were sun-faded. The wind was just noisy again. Then he saw movement. Not much, just a flicker. Between the two birch trees near the stump, June used to set her mason jars on. At first, he thought it was a stray cat, but something about it didn't quite fit. The way it crouched low and calm. The way its ears moved like radar dishes, its legs long and fluid. It sat just at the edge of the trees, like it was waiting for something or someone. Robert squinted through the curtain, holding his breath without realizing it. The animal didn't move, didn't threaten, didn't beg. It just existed, fully, proudly, as if it had always been there. And perhaps it had. He didn't open the door. He didn't say a word. He just watched, and for the first time in months, the silence in the house felt different. Less empty, more like pause. There's a difference between absence and pause. Absence says, there's nothing here. Pause says, wait, something's about to happen. That morning, Robert couldn't explain it. He wouldn't even try. But something softened. A curtain pulled back just enough to let in a sliver of mountain light. He didn't see the animal again for a while after that. But he started leaving the curtain slightly open. Just a crack. He started brewing 2 mugs of coffee again. One stayed on the counter. It wasn't for anyone, but somehow it helped. He sat on the edge of the porch steps again, the first time in a year. The wind still blew. The squirrels still argued. But it didn't feel like an attack anymore. It felt like a conversation. Maybe you've known a silence like his. Maybe you've shut a window too, without meaning to. If you have, you're not alone. There are still sounds worth hearing. Still mornings worth opening the curtain for. Stay with us, because what Robert saw next would change everything. The first morning, Echo appeared. Not asking for help, not asking for anything, just being. It began with a shimmer of movement so still it could have been part of the woods. But once you see something wild watching you, you can't quite unsee it. The second time it happened, Robert was standing at his kitchen sink, rinsing out a mug. Steam rose up and fogged the window in front of him, the glass a soft blur between him and the morning outside. And through that blur, a shape, still, solid, gold-tinted by sunrise. At first, he thought it was a trick of light, maybe a deer bending low near the brush. But then it moved with a quiet precision that no deer ever had. A bobcat, small for its kind, probably young. Her fur glowed tawny against the frost, her short tail twitching in short, decisive flicks. There was a steadiness in her stance, not fear, not aggression, just awareness. Robert froze, sponge in hand. The faucet kept running. The animal's gaze flicked toward him, once unbothered, almost curious. And then, as if she'd seen all she needed to, she turned and disappeared back into the trees. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't even admit to himself that it happened. But the next morning, he was up earlier than usual, half expecting, half dreading another sighting. The forest edge was empty, only the slow thaw of early spring, but his eyes lingered there longer than before. He started noticing things he'd ignored for years, a pile of leaves disturbed near the fence, a single paw print pressed into soft earth by the woodpile. The bobcat wasn't staying close, but she was nearby, watching, passing through. He didn't know why that comforted him, only that it did. In that quiet, unspoken rhythm between human and wildcat, something began to shift. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough to stir the air in that little cabin. Robert didn't go looking for her. He didn't scatter food or call out, but he started keeping the backlight on longer at night, so I don't trip, he'd mutter. And he left the gate unlatched. Tiny gestures done without thinking. That's how trust starts, isn't it? Not with grand declarations, but with space. One morning she returned. He'd just set his coffee down when he saw her again, closer this time. Sitting by the fallen birch, her ears, sharp eyes steady. The frost outlined her shape like silver thread. She wasn't begging. She wasn't afraid. She just was. For several minutes they stayed like that, 2 living things, each measuring the other in quiet stillness. Then something small happened. A robin darted past, and the bobcat's gaze followed it. Her muscles rippled, a perfect machine of instinct and grace. Robert caught himself smiling, almost whispering, "You're beautiful." The sound startled even him. He hadn't heard his own voice out loud like that in months. He didn't know it yet, but that single morning would become part of his new routine. He'd sip coffee, eyes scanning the tree line, waiting. Sometimes she appeared for only a second, sometimes not at all. But he started planning his mornings around that possibility. He even began keeping a small journal, something June used to do. She called it listening with ink. He jotted down simple notes. April 3rd. Saw her again, sitting near the birch stump. The light caught her eyes like amber glass. April 5th. No sign. Heard something in the brush, though. Maybe her. April 6th. Bowl of water frozen. Left it by the porch anyway. It wasn't much, but those words marked time again. Gave shape to days that had long blended together. He didn't realize he was healing. He only knew he had a reason to look out the window. There's something about being quietly observed that humbles you. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, not with judgment or pity, but curiosity. The kind you feel when you spot another creature surviving in the same cold world. And maybe in her he saw a reflection of his own solitude. Both of them had learned how to live without company. Both had learned how to keep moving even when there was no one left to watch. But unlike him, she didn't shut the world out. She lived in it, completely, fearlessly. That realization landed softly like snowfall. He started opening the back door again, not stepping out, just standing there breathing in air that tasted of pine and rain. The forest didn't sound so harsh anymore. It had rhythm again. Layers. Even the bobcat's distant cry, something between a scream and a growl, no longer frightened him. It felt strangely like music. Here's the thing about encounters with wild animals, especially wildcats, bobcats. Creatures that carry both beauty and danger in equal measure, they remind us how alive the world really is. Most people in town never saw them. They read about bobcat sightings on local wildlife pages, maybe glanced at a blurry photo online and scrolled on. But seeing one in person, it's different. It rearranges something inside you. You realize that not everything has to belong to you to change you. Some things are meant to pass through your life just long enough to wake you up. As the weeks passed, Robert noticed subtle traces, paw marks leading to the edge of the porch. Sometimes when it rained, he'd see where she'd sat under the overhang, her prints surrounded by a soft ring of dry earth. He began to think of her as the neighbor. He didn't name her, at least not out loud, but when he wrote in his journal, the word came naturally, Echo, because that's what she felt like, an answer to a call he didn't know he'd made. Soon Robert's mornings had structure again. He woke with purpose, brewed his coffee the same way June used to, 2 scoops, a pinch of cinnamon, a slow pour. He started talking to the houseplants she left behind. He began noticing the way the light shifted through the kitchen window as the season changed. Every morning he checked the tree line first, not out of fear anymore, out of habit, out of hope. Echo never crossed the porch, but she stayed close. Sometimes she'd perch on a rock near the shed, other times along the fence. Always calm, always alert. And Robert began to understand her visits weren't about hunger. They were about presence. The forest wasn't intruding. It was inviting. Wild animals like bobcats rarely seek human contact. They're cautious by nature, masters of distance. And yet, every so often, one will return to the same place because something feels safe there. Maybe it's the smell of cedar, the steady sound of a voice humming, the absence of threat. That's what the wildlife experts call a non-reactive zone. But to Robert, it was something simpler, peace. In some quiet, wordless way, they'd found it together. Then came a morning that lingered differently. A light fog covered the yard, dew glistening on the railing. Robert had left his coffee unattended when he saw her again, closer than ever. She was walking along the side of the house, muscles smooth under her coat, her paws silent even on gravel. When she reached the porch steps, she paused, looked up. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. She didn't bolt, she didn't growl, just looked. And in that quiet stare, Robert felt something soften, the same feeling as when June used to smile at him across a crowded room, no words needed. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't move closer, didn't reach out, just stood still, let her look, let her leave when she chose. When she slipped back into the brush, he exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. And this time he smiled, a real one. Sometimes connection doesn't come with words or gestures or promises. Sometimes it's a glance through glass, a silent acknowledgement that you're both still here. Wild animals remind us of something we forget, that being alive is enough reason to show up again and again, even if nobody claps, even if nobody sees. Echo had no reason to stay near that old house, but she did. And in her company, Robert began returning to the world he'd locked away. In the weeks that followed, her visits became part of him. He didn't just watch anymore, he listened. To the wind in the pines, to the rustle of leaves announcing her arrival, to the steady thump of his own heart rediscovering rhythm. But one morning, she didn't come. The porch sat empty, the water bowl untouched, the yard too still. And that absence after all those mornings of waiting hit him harder than he expected. Have you ever grown used to something wild? Something you never meant to love, but did anyway? Stay with us, because what happens when the bobcat stops coming is what changes everything. He never planned to care for her, but the heart has a way of making room even when we don't mean to. He told himself he wasn't doing anything heroic. He didn't rescue a bobcat, he reminded himself. He only stopped closing the door. He never thought of himself as someone who would leave bowls on the porch, or stack blankets by the shed, or pay attention to the soft, exacting tracks left by an animal's paws. Robert had been a practical man his whole life. Measure twice, cut once. Fix what breaks. Don't fuss over things you can't change. That steadiness saw him through grief at first. It was a shelter. But there's a subtle thing that happens when a wild thing starts appearing in your mornings. It nudges disciplines you didn't know you had into new directions. It asks for attention without asking for a single favor. And in the way of small, ordinary miracles, a routine is born. He didn't go out hunting for her. He didn't set traps or try to coax her with chicken. He wasn't the sort of man to call anyone to declare he'd met a bobcat. Instead, he made space. First, it was the water dish. He'd noticed one morning that the bowl by the woodpile was empty, untouched, and the frost had crusted around it. He filled it. Not because he wanted to feed a wildcat, but because the idea of the bowl sitting full in winter felt wasteful. Then, after a few more mornings, he left it again. And again. It became a small promise: there will be water here if you want it. Next, the light. He told himself it was to keep the porch from being treacherous at night. The truth was simpler. The soft glow made the yard feel kinder. The dark no longer felt as if it were poised to strike. It felt like a room where a visitor might choose to sit. These are tiny acts. Tiny acts are not acts of rescue in the dramatic sense. No sirens, no headlines, no applause. But they are where trust grows. In animal rescue circles, people talk about safe space a lot. Not every animal that comes near a human wants to be tamed. Often they want a place that feels secure enough to be themselves. Robert, without thinking of it as charity, had begun to make one. One morning in late April stands out in his memory. The porch was still gray with dawn. He had slept oddly, waking at 3, thinking of the way June used to hum while she did the dishes. He walked half asleep to the back door, cupped his coffee with both hands, and peered out. There, by the wooden planter that rotted from last year's rains, Echo sat like a small lit sculpture. Her ears were tilted as if listening to the same thing he was. Maybe the hum of a truck far away, maybe a bird waking. He felt ridiculous, but he put his mug down and grabbed the old quilt June had mended years ago. He folded it slowly, the way his hands remembered, and left it over the lower railing where it didn't touch the ground. It wasn't meant for her. It was meant because making something warm felt right. Later, when he checked the porch, the quilt was a shade flatter where she'd brushed past, no footprints on it, no signs she'd slept there. But the bowl of water had less in it. Small paw prints circled the porch post. The sight of those prints, 3 toe marks, a pad, pressed like a soft coin into wet wood, felt like a reply. That night, Robert went to bed with the faintest ease in his chest. It was the accumulation of these small events. A full bowl poured out into the snow by the morning sun. A quiet outline of a feline shadow at dusk that shifted something in him. He began arranging his mornings around the possibility of her appearing, not from obligation, but from a gentle anticipation. People talk about bonding as if it requires words, as if true connection is measured in conversation. But animal companionship reminds us otherwise. A glance can be more intimate than a paragraph. A shared stillness can be more sustaining than an hour-long talk. Robert found that his days made room for silence that felt full, not hollow. Where grief had made him shrink this new pattern, tending a bowl, smoothing a blanket, listening for a scrape at the fence made him expand in small, careful ways. The repetition of small kindnesses became a scaffold for feeling alive again. He never whispered promises to Echo. He never called anyone to say, "She trusted me today." He kept his face neutral, his voice low. But sometimes in the early mornings, when the mist hung low and the world seemed to wait for something to happen, he would catch himself talking softly about the most ordinary things. "You'd like this weather, June," he'd say. "Feels like you'd laugh at the way the creek runs." And once he said, not to anyone in particular, "You're welcome here." He didn't know whether she could understand. It didn't matter. He had offered an acknowledgement, and that felt like repair. There's a common impulse in heartwarming stories about animals to rush toward the dramatic rescue, the baby bobcat tied with a ribbon, the adoption papers, the triumphant before and after photo. Those tales make good headlines and tidy endings, but the truth is often quieter and more interesting. Not every interaction between human and wild becomes a rescue in the conventional sense. Sometimes the rescue is mutual and subtle. He didn't name himself her savior. He named himself her neighbor. She didn't become a pet. She remained a wildcat, tender in her distance, fierce in her independence. And in that balance between nearness and wildness, something like healing took place. There's dignity in staying wild. There's also comfort in being witnessed. Robert learned to respect both. He learned that you can offer help without imposing your will, an idea that applies as much to human relationships as it does to animal rescue. The best kind of aid is often the kind that preserves the other's autonomy. One week a storm rolled through wind rain, the kind of weather that makes the old house creak like it's remembering another life. The power went out. He fumbled for a flashlight and then for the matches. At dawn, after the gusts had calmed, Robert stepped out to see the aftermath. The creek had risen, a few small branches littered the yard, but Echo's bowl was in place. It had been knocked and half buried by the rain, but someone somewhere had nudged it back upright. He didn't know if she had done it or if raccoons had been curious. The point wasn't the action itself, but the fact that the bowl had mattered enough to be disturbed and set right. He took that as another sign, another small footnote in the story they were writing together. There was something else happening beneath these gestures, a change in how he saw himself. Where he had been only a man who kept to the house, he became a man who kept watch. Where he had been content with solitary routines, he found room for gentle responsibility. That responsibility didn't demand heroics, it only asked for consistency. Friends noticed. His sister called less with gentle worry and more with curiosity. "Are you getting out more cooed, Mary, over the phone?" He shrugged, said, "A bit." At the hardware store, a neighbor waved and asked if he'd be at the cookout. He smiled and said, "Maybe." The ripple effect of a single habit watching for a bobcat at the tree line was larger than he expected. But then, as often happens with the best kinds of quiet stories, an absence arrived. One morning he woke and checked the tree line the same way, mug in hand, quilt over the railing. The spot where Echo usually sat was empty. The water bowl was full, untouched. The prints weren't there. The absence wasn't dramatic at first. It was a hollow, a small missing piece at the margin of his day. But missing compounded itself into a weight. He found himself scanning the road more purposefully, walking toward the fence to see if there were fur clinging to the rails, listening for the distinct, unsettling call sometimes called the bobcat scream. When she didn't come back that afternoon, then that evening, he felt something like alarm. Not because he thought he was responsible for every creature in the woods, he knew better than that. But because in that small ritual, he had staked a piece of his days. When it vanished, he realized how much of himself was wrapped around these tiny duties. Have you ever become the reluctant caretaker of something, an idea, a plant, a neighbor's stray? Sometimes the smallest acts of attention open the door to a deeper life. Hold on with us. What happens when the visitor goes missing is where the true test begins. The first absence and the ache he didn't expect, how loneliness can suddenly feel like loss all over again. The thing about a routine is you rarely notice how much it means until it disappears. And when a wild animal stops showing up, there's no note left behind. It was a Tuesday. Robert remembers because he'd folded the newspaper just a little neater than usual. The forecast had called for early fog and a chance of drizzle by dusk. The kind of soft day he'd grown to appreciate, quiet gray, not demanding anything from anyone. He poured his coffee at 6:20 just like always. Sat in his chair by the kitchen window. The ceramic bowl outside had been refilled the evening before, still holding that slight shimmer of spring rain that made it look like melted glass. He waited. He scanned the same patch of yard. He always did, the clearing near the fallen birch, the shadow between the two pine trunks, the low rise just beyond the compost bin where she liked to perch. Nothing. But that wasn't unusual. Echo didn't arrive on a schedule. Some mornings she was early. Other days she slipped past just before noon. There were even stretches 2-3 days when she'd vanish altogether, only to return as if no time had passed. As if she belonged there more than he did, so he didn't worry. Not at first. Bobcats, like most wild animals, live on their own terms. They don't owe you their presence. They move with instinct, not loyalty. That's part of their mystery and their dignity. Robert had always known this. He reminded himself every time Echo slipped in and out of his mornings, "She's not mine." Still, he couldn't help but look out the window more often that day. By lunchtime, his walks around the yard had more purpose than usual. He found himself lingering by the woodshed, his eyes tracing the line where paw prints used to pattern the dirt. The bowl was still full. By evening, he had glanced through the curtains so many times the fabric started to fray a little at the edge. Still no sign, no movement, no echo. That night, Robert left the porch light on longer than usual. He stepped outside before bed, something he hadn't done since the week June passed. The wind was soft. The stars were faint. He didn't bring a flashlight. Just stood there on the steps, hands in his sweater pockets, scanning the edge of the woods with eyes that had learned to see what most people miss. A rustle made him lift his head, but it was only a squirrel scuttling up the trunk. Another shape moved through the grass, but it wasn't her. Too small, too fast, maybe a rabbit. He whispered something then. Not a prayer, not a name, just a sound. Half hope, half surrender. Then he turned off the light. Loss doesn't always come crashing in with sirens and sorrow. Sometimes it tiptoes in through an empty morning, a missed glance, a silence where there used to be rustling leaves. And when you've already walked through grief, as Robert had, you recognize the shape of absence even when it wears a different coat. Echo wasn't his pet. She wasn't someone he'd raised or fed or held. And yet her absence pressed against the corners of his day like cold air through a cracked door. Not painful, but undeniable. It reminded him uncomfortably of the days right after June's funeral, how the air inside the house felt too still, how the floorboards no longer creaked the same way, how the fridge seemed louder because nothing else was making noise. He realized now it wasn't Echo herself he missed. It was what she represented. Something wild, something alive, something that chose to return even when she didn't have to. There's a kind of love that forms in the spaces between words. The kind you don't talk about because talking would break it. The bond between a human and a wild animal is like that. Not quite trust, not quite friendship, but something more fragile and more powerful than both. When Echo didn't show up that morning and the next, Robert began to understand that his daily rhythm wasn't built around seeing her. It was built around being ready to see her, and that maybe was the real gift. She had given him something he hadn't felt in a long time: expectation, the gentle thrill of maybe, the quiet promise of possibility. And now that she was gone, possibly just moved on, possibly not. He had to ask himself the harder question. Would he still show up? Would he still pour the water? Still scan the trees? Still step onto the porch with his coffee and stand in the wind, even if no one greeted him? It's easy to care when someone is watching, harder when they're not. But isn't that the real test? On the fourth morning, Robert still went outside. He took longer to lace up his boots. The air smelled of rain and wet bark. The bowl was where he'd left it. The blanket he'd folded near the railing was undisturbed. Even the birds seemed more subdued, as if holding their breath. Still, no echo. But instead of retreating to his chair right away, Robert walked to the edge of the yard. Slowly, cautiously, not wanting to seem like he was searching even though he was. He paused by the same pine where he'd once seen her crouched like a statue watching him. She wasn't there. But something else caught his eye. A feather, white-tipped, caught in a piece of bark, and next to it 2 soft impressions in the mud barely visible. Paw prints, faint, old, but real. And for some reason he smiled. In wild animal rescue, it's well understood that when a bobcat disappears, it doesn't mean something's wrong. It might mean she's found a mate. It might mean her territory shifted. It might mean food led her elsewhere. And still those who observe them, especially those who grow attached, feel the ache of their absence like a faded scar warming in the rain. Robert didn't call any shelters, didn't report her missing, didn't post on message boards asking for sightings. He just kept the bowl full. June had once told him that real love wasn't just what you gave someone, it was what you kept giving even when they didn't notice. He didn't understand it at the time. But now, as he stood alone on the porch each morning, coffee cooling in his hand, he finally did. Echo had become more than a wild visitor. She was a mirror, a soft-pawed reflection of the part of him that still wanted to give, even when no one was watching. By the end of the week, Robert had accepted something. Whether Echo returned or not wasn't the point anymore. What mattered was that she'd been there. That she'd opened something in him, something he thought had closed forever. And maybe, just maybe, that opening was still wide enough for life to keep entering. But healing, like wild animals, rarely travels in a straight line. And just when he began to let go of the hope of seeing her again, he heard something. Not a sound he could explain, not a scream, not a growl, but a shift in the wind, a rustle that sounded familiar. And this time he stepped outside without hesitation. Have you ever felt someone's absence more than their presence? The memory of connection can be its own kind of companionship. Stay close. Because sometimes when we least expect it, the forest answers back. The daily habits that grew not from loss, but from quiet hope. And how they shaped a man who once wanted silence into someone who began to listen. It started as a way to wait. Then it became a way to live. The bobcat didn't just show up in his yard. She showed up in his rhythm. Mornings used to be something Robert endured. A slow rising, a cup of coffee, more about habit than hunger, a chair near the window where he stared without seeing. The world outside kept going, birds calling, branches brushing against the shed, the occasional distant bark of a neighbor's dog. But he stayed still. When June passed, the morning lost its color. It stopped meaning anything. It became just something to get through. But somewhere in those weeks of quiet visits from Echo, something else began to take root. And when she didn't return for a few days, he realized the habits she'd drawn him into hadn't left with her. In fact, they'd grown stronger. Rituals are often misunderstood as routines, but rituals are more than repetition. They are sacred in their own small way. They hold intention even if unspoken. For Robert, what began as a hesitant pouring of water into a bowl had become something else entirely, a quiet commitment to presence. To being there even when there was no clear reason. It's strange, he thought, how a wild animal, untamed, unpredictable, could give his day more shape than anything else. The rituals were simple, but they were deeply felt. Each morning, before the sun pulled itself fully over the ridge, Robert would open the back door. Not dramatically, just enough to let the cool air meet his face. He'd step out mug in hand and feel the deck's worn planks under his socks. The bowl sat in its usual spot. If the night had been cold, frost rimmed its edge like a delicate glass. If it had rained, it shimmered full and soft. He'd tilt it slightly, empty the old water into the bushes, and refill it from the kettle he kept warm on the stove. He told himself the fresh water was for the raccoons, or the birds, or the squirrels. But every part of him knew better. After that, he'd sit for a moment sometimes on the porch step, sometimes in the rocking chair June once loved. He'd wrap the old quilt around his shoulders, the one she mended with lavender thread that frayed just right in the corners. And he would wait. Not with expectation, but with openness. Sometimes Echo came, sometimes she didn't, but the point wasn't her arrival anymore. It was the waiting, it was the sitting, it was the permission to be still and to feel that stillness was enough. There's a kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a sudden realization or a dramatic turning point. It comes like this, through a porch swept not because it's dirty, but because it feels good to tend to something. Through a fresh pot of tea brewed for one, but poured like someone else might show up. Through the simple act of brushing pollen off the window ledge so you can see the trees better. Echo had taught him that. Not through affection, not through contact, but through her absence. When she stopped showing up every day, Robert didn't shut the window again. He kept rising early, kept refilling the bowl, kept noticing the way the mist clung to the grass before sunrise. Because by then her visits weren't the reason he stepped outside. They were the invitation. The rest what grew in their wake, that was the real gift. Wild animals don't bond with humans the way pets do. They don't nudge your hand for food or press against your leg for warmth. But what they do offer, if you pay close enough attention, is the kind of companionship built on shared space, not dependence. That's rare and sacred. It asks for no ownership, no declarations, only respect. Echo, in her quiet way, reminded Robert of something he hadn't felt in years, that simply being with something, not fixing it, not changing it, not controlling it could be enough. That was the lesson. And over time, that lesson seeped into other corners of his life. He began tending the garden again, not all at once. The weeds had claimed most of it by then. But one morning, he found himself kneeling by the raised beds, pulling at the roots. He replanted lavender like June used to. Then a patch of mint, a single row of marigolds. He took out the bird feeder from the shed, repaired the bottom with wire and tape, hung it from the old hook by the kitchen window. He fixed the wobbly step, repaired the porch swing chain, sorted the canning jars in the cellar. None of it felt urgent. None of it was part of a plan. It was just care. Care in all its quiet forms. For the home, for the land, for the living things nearby. And though he wouldn't say it out loud for himself. One evening, just after dusk, Robert lit the oil lamp on the porch. He'd found an old field journal in June's storage box, pages curled with time. She used to jot down the names of animals she spotted: red-tailed hawk above the ridge, young doe near the mailbox, limping slightly. He started adding to it, in pencil, carefully. Bobcat not seen today, bowl full, rabbit prints by the back fence, small tan bird with white belly, look up species. It wasn't about being scientific, it was about paying attention. And the more he paid attention, the more the world responded. People think healing comes from talking, and often it does. But sometimes healing comes from noticing. Noticing the way a shadow moves just a little differently when it's not alone. Noticing how your own breath slows when you watch something wild at peace. Noticing that your world, which once felt still and silent, is actually full of quiet movement. Echo didn't stay. She never truly belonged to him, but she changed him. She rearranged his mornings, taught him to expect something he couldn't name, invited him back to the world, not with words, but with pause and presence. One morning, much later, weeks after her last visit, Robert found himself stepping outside with something in his hand. Not a tool, not a broom, a piece of chicken left over from the night before. He placed it gently far from the house under the birch. He didn't do it because he thought she'd come. He did it because it felt right, because it felt like part of a promise. And when he turned around to go back inside, he caught something in the corner of his eye, movement. Low, slow, amber. She was back. Has something or someone ever changed your life just by being near? Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. Stay with us, because the day Echo returned was not the same as before. It was something deeper, and it changed everything again. When Robert fell ill, it wasn't the cold or the fever that surprised him. It was who kept showing up without needing to be asked. He didn't tell anyone he was sick, not the pharmacist, not his sister, not the neighbors, but somehow the bobcat knew. It was early November when the cold came. Not the weather, though, that had turned crisp and the trees along the ridge had let go of most of their leaves. No, it was his cold, the kind that doesn't knock you over at first. Just lingers, creeps in behind the ribs, makes the knees ache and the breath shallow. Robert figured it would pass. Probably just one of those seasonal things. He told himself he was fine. Told himself he didn't need anyone. Told himself it was nothing. So he stayed quiet. Didn't cancel the mail. Didn't mention anything when Mary called. Just brewed more tea and took longer naps in the afternoon. He skipped his morning walk a few times. Left the water bowl half full, the porch unswept. Let things slip just a little. And that's when she came back. Bobcats are elusive. Even the ones that learn to trust the edges of human space don't often linger unless they feel safe. They don't beg. They don't comfort. They observe. That's what Echo did. She didn't reappear with a grand entrance. There was no sound to announce her. Just a presence sudden and quiet. One morning, Robert had barely dragged himself out of bed. His chest was tight, his head cloudy. Still, he pulled the curtain aside out of habit. And there she was on the edge of the porch, sitting like stone. Unmoving, unflinching, watching him. He froze. She didn't run. He waved weakly. Just once. She blinked and stayed. The next day she was there again. Same spot, same stillness. Robert managed to make it to the porch. He didn't sit, just stood with his hand on the rail. The cold morning air burned in his lungs. Echo remained 10, maybe 12 feet away, just far enough to stay wild, close enough to mean something. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. But something passed between them in that quiet, unhurried moment. Not sympathy, recognition. That night, wrapped in 2 quilts, he thought back to the days after June's diagnosis. The hospital appointments, the waiting rooms, the words that came in hushed voices, aggressive, terminal, short time left. June had faced it with courage, dignity, even lightness some days. But there had been moments, just the two of them, where she didn't want comfort. She didn't want advice. She just wanted someone to be there, to sit beside her, to witness. That's what Echo was doing now. There's a certain kind of presence that asks for nothing but gives everything. No questions, no solutions. Just here. In a world that moves too fast, that demands performance and productivity, even in sickness, Robert found himself grateful for the company of something that didn't expect him to be strong. Echo didn't flinch when he coughed, didn't judge when he looked worn, didn't turn away from his stillness. Instead, she returned. Every morning. Some days he only had the strength to crack the door open and sit by it, the blanket tucked around his legs. He'd sip warm broth from a mug, and she'd be there, sometimes closer now, just a few paces from the bottom stair. Ears flicking, eyes calm. It became a new ritual, born not from energy, but from surrender. Not all animal companionship looks like tail wags and purring. Sometimes it's a bobcat sitting just outside reach. A wild heart that chooses to stay nearby, not to be pet, not to be fed, but to witness your struggle without looking away. And isn't that what we all want deep down? To not be looked away from? We think of wild animals as separate from us, but perhaps they know something we forget, how to be with one another, even in silence. Especially in silence. Echo didn't nurse him, didn't fetch water or warm his hands. She simply came. And in her coming, Robert felt less alone. One night, the fever broke. He woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding like boots on a porch. For the first time in days, he had the energy to stand without dizziness. At sunrise, he stepped onto the porch, slower than usual, but upright. The sky was streaked with pale orange, the kind of light June used to call forgiving. He didn't see her at first, but when he moved to the railing, he saw the paw prints, fresh curved, just so, leading up to the spot by the birch, where she often waited. She'd been there. had probably been there most of the night. Biologists have documented cases of bobcats returning to the same safe area repeatedly over months, even years, if nothing startles or threatens them. Especially in colder seasons, they may rest near human structures where they feel secure. But safety isn't always about shelter. Sometimes it's about energy, emotion. Robert's property had become familiar ground for her. Not because it was fenced or baited, but because it felt consistent. And maybe because she sensed something in him, something that mirrored her own solitude. Two creatures used to keeping their distance. And slowly, not. Over the following week, Robert grew stronger. His voice returned. His steps steadied. He began sweeping again, one hand on the railing moving slow but sure. Echo still came. Not every day now, but often enough. He didn't need her presence the same way, but her visits remained a comfort. Not a lifeline anymore, just a reminder that something wild had once seen him at his weakest and stayed. That kind of memory lives deep in the bones. The winter stretched long and quiet. Snow fell early that December, covering the porch in a blanket so white it looked untouched by time. Echo's prints still appeared now and then, always precise, always temporary. But life inside the house had shifted again. Robert didn't dread the mornings anymore. He rose with care, not reluctance. Lit a candle in the kitchen, opened the window a crack to hear the wind better. He even found himself humming June's song, the one she always sang while folding laundry. He couldn't remember the lyrics, just the melody. And one morning, just as the snow began to melt, he looked up. She was back. But this time something was different. Have you ever been held not by hands, but by presence? Stayed with, not because someone had answers, but because they refused to leave? If so, you know what Robert felt. Stay close. What happens next is not about Echo's return. It's about what her return reveals. When spring arrived, Robert didn't just feel better. He felt changed. The forest hadn't healed him, but it had taught him how to live again. Robert thought the bobcat had brought him comfort. But it turned out what she gave him was permission to live again, to belong to the morning. By the time the daffodils pushed through the frost-crusted earth, Robert had stopped wondering whether Echo would come back. He still looked, of course. Each morning he poured warm water into the bowl, like always. He stepped out with his coffee quilt over his shoulder and scanned the usual places between the birch trunks, behind the woodpile, along the low ridge past the fence. But it was different now. The looking wasn't desperate. It was part of the rhythm, like brushing his teeth, like flipping open June's field journal and writing a few lines, sometimes about weather, sometimes about dreams. She didn't come every day, and when she did appear again on that pale, soft morning in late February, he felt no jolt, no gasp, just a quiet warmth, like watching someone come home without knocking. Healing isn't always marked by a big breakthrough. Sometimes it's measured in the quiet ways we re-enter life. A window left open, a pair of shoes kept by the door, the way our hands reach for the broom again, not because the porch is dirty, but because we want to care for it. The bobcat had never asked anything of Robert. She'd never needed saving. She came and went on her own time with her own rules. And yet, she gave him something more enduring than companionship. She gave him the gift of being needed again, not as a caretaker, not as a savior, just as a presence, someone who shows up. In early March, after the last big snow, Robert made soup. Not because he was sick, not because anyone was coming over, just because the scent filled the house in a way that made it feel lived in again. That day, he placed a bowl on the porch, not the soup, of course, but a fresh dish of warm water beside the woodpile. The sky was heavy with mist, and his breath left long trails in the cold air. Echo emerged from the brush like she'd been there all along. Her fur was thicker now, her body stronger. She'd grown over the winter. She didn't approach the bowl right away, just sat. Watched him, ears tilted slightly the way she always did when she was listening. He didn't speak, he just nodded, slowly, then turned and went inside, leaving the door cracked a few inches. She drank. And when he came back an hour later, the bowl was empty. But there were prints in the snow-soft arcs of wildcat paws pressed into the porch wood. One set, then two. She'd circled. She'd lingered. There's something sacred about being visited by something that could leave and doesn't. We often underestimate what it means to be chosen. Not once, not loudly, but quietly over time. Robert didn't think of himself as someone who needed to be chosen anymore. He'd had love. He'd had a good marriage. He'd raised gardens and carved furniture and kept his promises. But grief strips identity. It hollows your days. It makes the hours blur. It takes away the tiny confirmations that you matter. And Echo, this bobcat who never let him touch her, who never curled up by his fire, somehow gave that back. Not with affection, but with presence, with continuity, with return. In rescue work, we talk about the animal that was saved. The dog pulled from the flood. The kitten warmed from the snow. The bobcat cub found alone and brought to a shelter. But sometimes the roles reverse. Sometimes it's the human who's found, not in dramatic rescues, but in something quieter, in the way a creature rewilds our hearts, makes us pay attention again, invites us back into rhythm breath awareness. It's a companionship that doesn't need leashes or fences, just space, trust, time. Echo never lived in Robert's home, but she lived in his days, and that made all the difference. By April, Robert's world had grown larger. He started walking again, not far, but enough to feel the forest under his boots. He greeted neighbors more freely, stopped by the post office without rushing. He even visited the community garden one weekend, bringing leftover marigold seeds from June's stash. A woman complimented his jacket. Another asked if he liked animals. He smiled and said, "I live next to a wildcat." They laughed. He didn't explain. It was a good day. At home, the bird feeder stayed full. The porch was always swept. The old rocking chair no longer sat empty on the far side. He'd moved it closer to the railing, closer to where Echo sometimes watched him. He started noticing things again. How the pine needles gathered in perfect spirals when the wind blew from the west. How the creek behind the shed glowed blue-green after it rained. How the squirrels learned not to run when he stepped outside. They just paused, looked, and resumed. It was a small world, but it was alive again. One morning near the end of spring, Robert found himself humming while slicing apples. A simple tune, nothing particular. He opened the back door to toss the cores near the compost, and there she was. Echo, closer than before. Not perched on a log, not standing off at the tree line. She was on the porch, sitting not tense, her paws tucked beneath her, her eyes calm. She blinked at him. He didn't move. He set the apple down, sat gently in the chair, let the silence settle. No camera, no audience, just a man and a bobcat sharing a morning. The gift wasn't her nearness, it was his readiness to receive it. It's not about taming or ownership or turning the wild into something domesticated. It's about recognizing that life, when it's ready, comes close. And if we are still enough, kind enough, patient enough, it stays just long enough to shift us. We may never hold it, but we remember the shape of its presence forever. Robert didn't mark the day Echo stopped visiting. There was no farewell, no final glance. But he was okay with that, because by then he no longer needed her to come back. He had learned how to listen to the wind again, to greet the morning without fear, to open the window without bracing for what might come in. But just when he thought the story had settled, a quiet life, a quiet porch, something unexpected happened. Has something wild ever changed you without ever touching you? Something that stayed just long enough to help you return to yourself, if so? You know what Robert knows, and what happens next might remind you that healing is not a straight line. Stay with us. The forest still has more to say. Not a goodbye, not an ending, but a new kind of beginning where the man who once shut the world out finds comfort in letting it in. There was no final visit, no dramatic moment, no sound to mark her leaving. But Echo had done what she came to do, and Robert was no longer the man who shut the window. Spring eased into summer, the way soft light filters through lace curtains gently without asking for attention. The air warmed. The garden bloomed without fanfare, and the morning routine, though now his alone, still held its place like a well-worn trail through memory. Robert no longer waited for Echo, but he still poured the water. He still sat on the porch each morning with his coffee, watching how the birds quarreled in the feeder or how the light stretched itself across the fence posts. The window stayed open, all day sometimes. Not for her, not anymore. For the life that was still around him, for the breeze, for the rustle of wild grass, for the soft shuffle of paws he might never see again, but still honored. Healing doesn't always mean the return of what you lost. Sometimes it means learning how to live fully, even if what touched you has gone. Sometimes the truest rescue isn't about saving another, but about remembering how to stay open when something unexpected comes to save you. Echo's role in Robert's life was never to stay. It was to show up just long enough to awaken something in him: rhythm, curiosity, trust. And now, months after her last visit, that awakening had taken root in ways no one else could see. But he felt it. In the way his chest didn't tighten each morning. In how the silence no longer echoed but hummed. In the space he kept sacred, not for a bobcat's return, but for what it meant that she ever came at all. There's a moment not long ago that says more than anything else. It was dusk, the kind of evening that holds the heat from the day and wraps the hills in a golden hush. Robert stood by the window, tea in hand, watching a young fox cross the yard, tail high, cautious but not afraid. A few years ago he might have clapped or grumbled about the noise, closed the blinds. Instead, he stood perfectly still. He watched the animal disappear into the tall grass. Then he turned, walked outside, sat on the porch step and looked at the sky. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. In our lives, there are wild moments. Some are fierce, some are quiet. Some arrive in the form of grief, others in the shape of unexpected companionship. Echo was never his pet, never his responsibility. She was a bobcat, fiercely independent, mysterious, untamed. But she brought with her the kind of presence that softens a heart without breaking it open. The kind that asks nothing yet changes everything. She reminded Robert what it meant to pay attention again, to walk slowly, to keep something warm nearby, to choose wonder over resistance. And maybe in her own way she learned something too, that not every human builds fences, that some simply open the door and wait. There's a myth that rescue is one-sided, that the stronger saves the weaker, that the human saves the animal. But what if it's not about strength at all? What if real rescue lives in the space between two living beings, where presence is enough and healing flows quietly? Both ways, Robert didn't need to be saved in the dramatic sense, but he needed to be seen, witnessed, reconnected to something ancient and true, something that doesn't speak in words but in pause, in breath, in shared stillness. And Echo. She needed nothing from him, but she came back, again and again. Not for food, not for shelter, but for the kind of unspoken safety that the wild rarely finds among people. And maybe, just maybe, she healed something in herself by returning. You don't need to live near a forest to experience this. Sometimes the healing comes from a rescued kitten who curls up on your lap when your heart is heavy. Sometimes it's a squirrel you see every day from your window who over time becomes part of your life's rhythm. Sometimes it's a dog at the shelter who places a paw on your knee and changes everything. These moments aren't small. They're sacred. They remind us of the bond that's always existed between people and animals, not built on ownership, but on quiet respect, on curiosity, on shared space. When you welcome a creature, wild or domestic, into your day, you don't just give them a chance to live. You give yourself the chance to feel alive again. Robert's story reminds us that wild animal rescue doesn't always take place inside a shelter. Sometimes it happens right on your back porch. Sometimes the bobcat you don't name, the one who screams in the night or leaves muddy paw prints by your shed, becomes part of your healing. Bobcat rescue, like all animal rescue, isn't just about survival. It's about restoring connection to nature, to wonder, to the parts of ourselves that remember how to love without needing to possess. That's why stories like these matter. Because whether it's a baby bobcat curled beneath a pine tree, or a big cat pacing behind tall grass, or a wild cat who chooses to greet an old man, each morning the message is the same: life still finds us. Even when we think we're no longer worth finding, Robert still lives in that same house beneath the ridge. The windows stay open now, even when the wind picks up. He keeps a bird feeder full of bowl of water out by the steps and a quilt folded neatly over the porch rail. Not because he's waiting, but because he's ready. He's found comfort in the wildness, in the uncertainty, in the knowledge that some visitors never stay, but their echoes linger long after they're gone. Sometimes in the middle of the night he still wakes to the sound of something moving outside. He smiles, turns over, and goes back to sleep. Now pause just for a second. Ask yourself, have you ever had a quiet visitor change your life? A creature that didn't need you, but found you anyway? What's the echo in your story? If this story touched you, if it reminded you of something, or someone you'd nearly forgotten, consider leaving a comment. We'd love to hear about your own animal companions, wild or domestic, who helped you heal in some quiet way. And if you'd like to see more heartfelt stories like this, ones that remind us of the quiet power of animal companionship, of wildlife rescue, of second chances, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell more stories that matter. If you feel moved, consider tapping the super thanks below or visiting the link in the description to donate. Every small gift helps protect wild animals. Like Bobcats supports wildlife rescue teams and gives people like Robert a chance to heal alongside nature. Together we can make space for pause, for peace, for presence. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, leave the window open.